The international airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers dragging suitcases, announcements echoing through the terminal, and long lines forming at the immigration counters. Among the crowd, a man walked quietly, dressed simply in a plain polo shirt, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He carried himself with calm humility, blending in with the hundreds of passengers arriving that morning. That man was Manny Pacquiao, though almost nobody recognized him at first glance. As he approached the immigration desk, he handed over his passport with a polite smile. The officer behind the glass barely glanced at it. His eyes narrowed, and instead of the usual routine check, he scoffed loudly enough for others in line to hear. "Step aside," the officer barked. "You don't belong here." Manny was taken aback. "Excuse me?" he asked, keeping his voice respectful. The officer leaned forward, his tone sharp and dismissive. "I said step aside. Don't waste my time. You people always try to sneak through with stories. Get out of the line." The passengers waiting nearby turned their heads. Some looked confused. Others smirked, entertained by the drama. Manny stood quietly, gripping his documents, not raising his voice, not reacting with anger. "I assure you," he said softly, "my papers are valid. Please check again." But the officer wasn't interested in checking. He pushed Manny's passport back across the counter carelessly, letting it fall to the floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have, a small but sharp humiliation. The crowd gasped. A woman in line whispered, "Wow, harsh." A businessman nearby shook his head but said nothing. The officer straightened up with arrogance, gesturing toward the side. "Pick up your things and wait over there. You're not entering on my watch." For a moment, Manny bent down, picked up his passport, and simply held it in his hands. His face remained calm, though inside anyone could sense the sting of disrespect. The scene was shocking. Here was a man of global stature treated like nothing, as though his humility made him invisible. And yet, Manny did not argue. Not yet. He simply stood there silent while the officer continued barking orders. What happened just 9 minutes later left the entire airport stunned. The officer's voice carried through the immigration hall, sharp and filled with disdain. He waved his hand dismissively as if Manny Pacquiao was nothing more than a nuisance holding up the line. Passengers behind began whispering, some impatient, others curious about the unfolding scene. Manny, holding his passport and documents firmly in his hand, took a steady breath. He didn't want to create a scene, nor did he wish to embarrass anyone. He had lived his life believing in humility, even when faced with insults. But the way this officer treated him, like he was some criminal trying to sneak into the country, pierced deep. "I understand you're busy," Manny said politely, his voice steady, "but if you just check my documents carefully, you will see everything is in order." The officer smirked, clearly enjoying the authority he thought he had. He leaned across the counter, lowering his voice but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Save your excuses. I've seen plenty like you. You think because you dress clean and act calm, you can walk in easily? Not on my shift. You don't belong here." Those words, "you don't belong here," struck harder than any punch. Manny's life was built on proving he belonged everywhere he fought, everywhere he served. From the streets of General Santos to the boxing rings of Las Vegas, from the slums of his childhood to the Senate floor of his nation, belonging wasn't given to him, he had earned it. And now this man, with no knowledge of who he truly was, dismissed him with cruelty. A small group of travelers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One woman in the line muttered, "Why is he treating him like that? He hasn't done anything wrong." But most people remained silent, afraid to get involved. Manny's hand tightened around his passport. He could have raised his voice, could have demanded respect, but instead he chose dignity. His calmness only seemed to frustrate the officer more. "Don't just stand there," the officer snapped. "Move to the holding area or I'll have security escort you." He motioned toward 2 uniformed guards nearby, who stepped closer, ready to follow orders without question. Inside, Manny thought of his wife, his children, his people. How many times had ordinary Filipinos been treated exactly like this, humiliated by people in power who thought a uniform gave them the right to degrade others? He felt the sting not only for himself but for every ordinary traveler who had no voice, no influence, no chance to fight back. The officer glanced at the growing crowd, then smirked again as if putting on a performance. See, ladies and gentlemen, this is why we must be careful. Not everyone with a passport deserves to enter. Some try to cheat the system. We're the first line of defense. The arrogance was suffocating. The people in line grew restless. Phones were raised discreetly, recording the exchange. Someone whispered, "This is too much." That man hasn't even raised his voice. Manny finally spoke again, his tone still even, his words carefully chosen. "Sir, I am not here to cause you trouble. I only ask for fairness. Please treat me as you would any traveler. Nothing more, nothing less." But fairness was the last thing on the officer's mind. He scoffed loudly, eyes flashing with contempt. "Fairness? Don't preach to me about fairness. I've been doing this job for years. I know who to trust and who to reject. And I don't trust you." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffling of impatient travelers. The two security guards stood close, waiting for orders. Manny, though calm, was now at a crossroads. He had been insulted, humiliated, and mocked in front of strangers. Yet he remained dignified, his composure unbroken. What nobody knew was that this quiet patience, this silence, was not weakness. It was a storm-gathering strength. Manny Pacquiao had faced far greater opponents than this officer, in the ring, in politics, in life. And when he finally chose to act, the consequences would be swift and irreversible. But for now, he waited. He let the officer dig deeper into arrogance, let the crowd witness the injustice with their own eyes. Because in just a few minutes, the entire immigration hall would see exactly who they were mistreating, and everything would change. Have you ever seen someone abused by authority like this? Comment below where you're watching this from. The line at the immigration counter grew longer, but nobody dared complain out loud. Instead, the passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to see what was happening even as the tension at the desk grew heavier. A man of calm humility was being humiliated by an officer whose voice dripped with arrogance. The officer pointed aggressively toward the secondary holding area, his finger practically brushing Manny's chest. "Did you not hear me? Move, or I'll have you detained right here." Two security guards stepped closer, their hands resting near their belts, waiting for a signal. Manny remained still, his shoulders relaxed, his expression calm. He bent slightly, retrieved his passport again, and placed it carefully back on the counter. His voice when he spoke carried no anger, only quiet firmness. "Please," he said, "do your job properly. I've complied with every requirement. Check again. That's all I ask." The officer let out a mocking laugh. "Do my job? Don't tell me how to do my job. I said you're not cleared. You're wasting my time and you're wasting everyone else's time." He gestured toward the waiting passengers as though expecting applause for his efficiency, but applause never came. Instead, there were murmurs, low whispers that floated through the line. "Why is he treating him like that?" One woman muttered, clutching her handbag. "He looks so polite. He hasn't even argued." Another passenger whispered. A man in a suit shook his head, whispering louder than he realized. Some officers just love the power too much. Yet no one stepped forward. The bystanders became silent judges, some sympathetic, some skeptical. One young woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Maybe he really did something wrong." The officer wouldn't act like this for no reason. That whisper cut deep, not because Manny heard it, but because it echoed what countless ordinary people endure when mistreated by authority. Too often, the public assumes guilt when someone is shouted down by a uniform. Too often, silence enables injustice. Manny stayed still, his calmness a striking contrast to the officer's escalating fury. The officer slammed a stamp pad on the counter, making the travelers jump. "Do you think you're special? Do you think standing here quiet makes you innocent? I can smell liars from a mile away, and you? You don't belong here," the phrase repeated in "you don't belong here." Manny's grip tightened slightly on his passport, but his face didn't flinch. His silence now was more powerful than any words. It unnerved the officer, who seemed desperate for a reaction, for an outburst he could use as justification. But Manny refused to give him that satisfaction. Passengers began discreetly lifting their phones, recording the confrontation. Screens glowed faintly as the scene spread to multiple lenses. The officer noticed but didn't care. In his mind, he was untouchable. His arrogance grew with each passing second. One elderly man in the line whispered, "That officer, he's going too far." Another woman replied softly, "He's just doing his job. Maybe the man deserves it." The division in the crowd was palpable. Judgment, indifference, sympathy all colliding in silence. Meanwhile, the guards shifted their weight, glancing at each other uncertainly. Even they seemed uneasy at the officer's tone, though loyalty kept them rooted by his side. Manny finally spoke again, his words deliberate, his voice calm but resolute. "Respect should not be optional," he said softly. "Every traveler deserves dignity. You don't know me and I don't ask you to, but I ask you to treat me fairly." The officer rolled his eyes loud enough for everyone to hear. "Save the speeches for someone who cares. You're not special. You're just another problem." The silence that followed was suffocating. People shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact altogether. Others stared directly, their phones still recording. It was as if the entire hall was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. And then it happened. A small voice from the back of the line cut through the air. "Wait, isn't that Manny Pacquiao?" Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the line. A man pulled up a photo on his phone, comparing it with the man at the counter. The resemblance was undeniable. The whispers grew louder. "That's him. It's really him." "Manny Pacquiao? The senator? The boxing champion?" The officer frowned, annoyed at the noise, but still didn't realize the magnitude of the mistake he was making. He waved his hand dismissively at the crowd. "I don't care who he thinks he is. He's not above the law. He's not passing through here." But the crowd knew. Recognition was spreading like wildfire. The same man who had lifted his nation out of poverty, who had given millions hope through his fists and his service, was standing humbly, enduring insults without retaliation. The whispers turned into a low rumble of outrage. People started to murmur louder. "How can he talk to Manny Pacquiao like that? This is unbelievable." Yet still Manny did not raise his voice. He stood silently, passport in hand, while the officer, blind to the truth, carried on with his tirade. The stage was set. The crowd was restless. The officer was too far into his arrogance to turn back, and Manny Pacquiao, calm, composed, and unshaken, was just minutes away from revealing who he truly was. The officer had no idea the man he mocked would soon have the power to decide his fate. The whispers were growing louder now, spreading like a spark through dry grass. Passengers craned their necks, eyes darting between their phones and the man standing silently at the counter. The resemblance was undeniable, but disbelief still lingered. Could it really be him? Could the quiet man enduring this humiliation truly be Manny Pacquiao? The officer, still oblivious to the storm building around him, slammed his palm on the counter. "Enough standing here. Move to the holding area or face detention." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. He relished the authority, blind to the fact that the very ground beneath him was about to shift. Manny remained calm. His passport rested once again on the counter, his hands steady, his posture upright. He did not raise his voice, nor did he argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a phone, and quietly tapped a message. His movements were subtle, almost invisible, but a few nearby noticed. The crowd's curiosity deepened. What was he doing? Who was he contacting? Was this humble traveler hiding more than anyone realized? The officer sneered, misinterpreting the act. "Calling for help? Go ahead. Call your friends. Call your lawyer. Nothing will change. You're not entering here without my approval." He leaned back in his chair, arrogance plastered across his face, convinced he had already won. But Manny didn't respond. He simply set his phone down on the counter, screen face down, and folded his hands together. His silence was unnerving. Meanwhile, the whispers had turned into conversations. A middle-aged man near the back of the line showed his phone to others. On the screen was a photo of Manny in a suit, speaking at a Senate event. "It's him. I swear it's him," the man said. Another traveler added, "Look at his hands. Those are a fighter's hands. I've seen them before." Recognition spread, building suspense. Yet the officer remained stubborn, dismissing the noise around him. "What's the matter with all of you? Don't get fooled by appearances. This man is nothing special." Still, Manny said nothing. His silence now was deliberate, almost strategic. He allowed the whispers to grow, allowed the truth to surface organically. In boxing, he had always known the value of patience, waiting for the right moment to strike. This was no different. A young boy, no older than 12, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mom, that's Pacquiao. I've seen his fights with Dad." The mother shushed him quickly, but her eyes widened as she studied Manny's face more closely. The tension in the hall was becoming unbearable. Phones were now openly recording, cameras capturing the officer's every sneer, every arrogant gesture. Some passengers were live streaming, broadcasting the unfolding drama to the world outside the airport. Manny finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the officer. His voice was steady, calm, yet carried a weight that made the crowd lean in. "Do you know who I am?" The officer laughed mockingly. "Of course not, and I don't care. You could be the king of the world, and I'd still send you to the holding area. My word is final here." The arrogance was almost painful to watch. The crowd gasped, some shaking their heads in disbelief. How could someone be so blind, so intoxicated with power, that he failed to recognize the very man standing before him? Just then, the tension snapped. From the far side of the hall, a senior immigration officer rushed toward the desk. His uniform was pressed neatly, his stride urgent. He had seen the live feed that was already circulating online. He had received calls in the last few minutes that made his heart race. As he approached, the crowd parted slightly. Whispers turned into hushed exclamations. "Finally, someone higher up is here." The senior officer stopped at the counter, his eyes widening the moment they landed on Manny. In an instant, his expression shifted from urgency to shock, and then to something else entirely, but respect. "Mr. Senator," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he bowed his head. "Forgive the delay. Please allow me to handle this personally." The entire hall froze. Gasps erupted. The word senator hung in the air like thunder. Phones captured every second, every reaction. The rude officer blinked in confusion, his arrogance faltering for the first time. What did you say?" he stammered. The senior officer repeated, louder this time for all to hear. "This is Senator Manny Pacquiao, champion, philanthropist, and a representative of his people." The crowd erupted. Some applauded softly, others simply stared in awe. The truth had finally broken through the fog of arrogance. The officer's face drained of color. His earlier confidence vanished, replaced by visible panic. He had mocked, insulted, and humiliated not just any traveler, but a national hero, a man respected across the globe. Manny, still calm, said nothing. He simply picked up his passport from the counter and waited, his silence more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. The suspense now hung in the air. The officer's fate was sealed, though he didn't know it yet. And the passengers, their phones still recording, knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a story that would spread far beyond the walls of that airport. But Manny's true response was not just about himself. It was about every traveler who had ever been humiliated like this. The immigration hall had turned into a stage. Phones were raised, cameras flashing, the crowd buzzing with whispers and disbelief. The rude officer stood frozen, his earlier bravado dissolving like sand in the tide. Across the counter, Manny Pacquiao remained still, calm, unshaken, his silence commanding more respect than any raised voice ever could. The senior officer bowed once again, speaking with urgency. "Senator Pacquiao, I deeply apologize for this treatment. Please let me escort you through immediately. This is unacceptable." Manny didn't take a step forward. Instead, he lifted his gaze to meet the senior officer's eyes, then shifted his attention back to the man who had humiliated him moments earlier. The entire hall fell silent, waiting. Would he accept the apology and move on, or would he speak? When Manny finally opened his mouth, his voice was calm, deliberate, and carried a weight that made every listener straighten in their seat. "Respect," he began softly, "is not something you give only when you know who someone is. Respect should be given to every traveler, every person, regardless of status or fame." The officer's throat bobbed nervously as Manny's words pierced the air. Manny continued, his voice steady but stronger now, building momentum like a fighter pacing toward his final round. "I stood here quietly, showing you my documents, speaking to you respectfully, yet you mocked me. You told me I did not belong, but I am not speaking for myself now. I am speaking for the countless men and women who pass through these halls every day. Ordinary people without cameras, without influence, without power. How many of them have suffered what you tried to do to me?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others whispered words of agreement. The truth in Manny's statement was undeniable. The officer stammered, I was only doing my duty." "Duty?" Manny cut in sharply, though his tone never lost control. Your duty is to uphold the law with fairness. Your duty is to serve with dignity, not to abuse your authority. When you tell someone they do not belong, when you humiliate them in front of strangers, you fail your duty." His words struck like blows, each one heavier than the last. The officer shrank visibly, his arrogance completely stripped away. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. The senior officer tried to intervene, speaking quickly. "Mr. Senator, please. The situation will be corrected immediately. I will ensure disciplinary action is taken." But Manny raised a hand gently, silencing him. His eyes swept across the hall, addressing not just the officers but the watching passengers, the recording cameras, the world that would soon see this unfold online. "This is not about me," he said firmly. "I am a public servant. I am a fighter. I can endure insults, but I will not stand by while ordinary citizens suffer the same. Every person deserves dignity. Every person deserves fairness. Whether rich or poor, famous or unknown, they all deserve respect." The hall erupted in applause, passengers clapping, cheering softly, some even wiping tears. The two guards who had been ready to escort Manny earlier shifted uncomfortably, lowering their eyes, ashamed of their silence. The rude officer, now pale and trembling, muttered, "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Manny's response was swift, his words like lightning. "That is the problem. You only care when you know, but respect should not depend on recognition. Respect is a human right." The cameras captured every second, his calm posture, his steady gaze, his powerful words. For many in that hall, it felt less like an airport confrontation and more like a masterclass in humility and leadership. The senior officer, realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded solemnly. "Senator, you are absolutely right. On behalf of this department, I take full responsibility. This behavior is shameful. I will make sure it is addressed immediately." But Manny wasn't finished. His next words turned the tide completely, sending shivers down the spine of everyone present. "This man does not represent just himself today. He represents the system. If I allow this to pass silently, what message will it send? That authority gives the right to disrespect? That uniforms protect arrogance? No, this ends here." The officer's knees nearly buckled. He knew his fate was sealed. He had humiliated the wrong man in front of the wrong crowd at the wrong time. The crowd, sensing the moment, began chanting softly, "Respect! Respect! Respect!" The word echoed through the hall, growing louder, fueled by emotion. Phones shook as people tried to capture the scene, their voices joining in. Manny, however, did not gloat. He didn't smile, didn't smirk. He stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had been humiliated, yet chose to rise above, not for revenge, but for justice. Finally, he stepped back slightly, giving one last look at the trembling officer. "I will not raise my hand against you. I will not insult you back, but I will ensure that this never happens again. Not to me, not to any traveler." The hall went silent again. Manny's words hung heavy, undeniable, unforgettable. In that moment, the balance of power had completely shifted. The officer was no longer in control. Manny Pacquiao, with nothing more than calm words and unshakable dignity, had taken the entire room, and soon the entire world, in his corner. And then, the unthinkable happened. The officer's punishment came swiftly, and the entire hall witnessed a reversal so powerful it left everyone stunned. The immigration hall was no longer just a checkpoint. It had become a courtroom, a theater, and a battlefield of dignity. Dozens of passengers had their phones lifted high, recording every second. By now, live streams had spread beyond the airport. Outside, social media was buzzing, hashtags igniting with fury and support. The senior officer, sweating under the gaze of the crowd, turned toward his colleague, the man who had dared to humiliate Manny Pacquiao. "You've gone too far," he said sternly. "Step aside. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation." The officer's eyes widened in horror. "Suspended for what?" "I was doing my job." His voice cracked with desperation, but the conviction he once carried was gone. His words no longer struck authority. They were the cries of a man watching his power slip away. The senior officer didn't flinch. "You mocked a respected senator, a world champion, in front of the public. But worse than that, you disrespected a traveler. That is not doing your job. That is abuse of power." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some clapped quietly, others muttered. Finally, the disgraced officer's face turned pale. He looked at Manny, who still stood firm, calm, unshaken. The officer's lips trembled. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Manny finally spoke, his tone steady but sharp enough to pierce the silence. "And what if I wasn't Manny Pacquiao? What if I were just another man, another father, another worker trying to see his family? Would you have treated me with the same cruelty?" The officer lowered his head, unable to answer. Manny's words carried through the hall, his voice clear, amplified by the absolute silence of those listening. "This is not about me. This is about the thousands of people who come through here, who face the same humiliation but have no voice, no cameras, no crowd to protect them. Authority is not a weapon. It is a responsibility." Applause erupted, louder this time. The passengers, united in the moment, cheered him on. Some even chanted his name, "Manny! Manny! Manny!" Others shouted, "Respect!" The echo shook the walls of the hall. The senior officer, now visibly ashamed on behalf of his department, bowed his head to Manny. "Sir, you are absolutely right. This will be reported immediately. He will face consequences for his actions." Two guards approached, not to intimidate Manny this time, but to escort the disgraced officer away. His shoulders slumped, his arrogance shattered. He walked past the crowd with downcast eyes. Phones followed his every step. He had entered the confrontation with smug confidence. He left it disgraced, his career hanging by a thread, but Manny wasn't finished. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying authority. The guard stopped. The officer froze, turning slightly to face him. The crowd hushed again, waiting for what would come next. Manny stepped forward. His presence was commanding yet humble. "I do not ask for this man to be destroyed. I do not wish for revenge, but I ask that this moment serve as a lesson. Treat every person with dignity, every single one. If not, you do not deserve the uniform you wear." The crowd roared in agreement. Tears welled up in the eyes of some travelers. It wasn't just about Manny anymore. It was about every person who had felt powerless in the face of arrogance. The officer, trembling, whispered, I'm sorry." Manny nodded, not in triumph but in solemn acknowledgement. Apologies matter only when followed by change. Remember that. With that, he stepped back, allowing the guards to lead the officer away. The hall erupted in cheers again, but Manny remained calm, dignified. He didn't raise his hands in victory, didn't bask in glory. His message was clear. This was not about his ego, but about justice. The senior officer addressed the crowd, his voice trembling with shame. "On behalf of this department, I extend my deepest apologies to Senator Pacquiao and to all of you who witnessed this. This behavior does not represent who we are supposed to be. But the truth was, it did represent a reality many had faced, and that's why the moment struck so deeply." Manny knew this, and that's why he turned to the passengers, looking not just at them but at the cameras capturing every frame. "To everyone watching," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "remember this: respect is free. It costs nothing to treat someone with dignity. Power does not excuse cruelty, and silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. We must all do better." The hall was silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause thundered again, filling the space like a wave. Passengers cheered not only for the man before them, but for the truth he had spoken. By now, the incident had already gone viral. Online viewers were flooding comment sections, praising Manny's humility and strength. Words like legend, true leader, and respect filled feeds across platforms. The world was watching and the world was moved, and as Manny finally stepped forward, documents cleared with ease. The officer's fate sealed, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. The humiliation had transformed into triumph, not a triumph of ego, but of principle. Justice had been served. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through dignity, humility, and an unshakable demand for respect. But the story didn't end at the airport. What happened next took the world by storm, and proved once again why Manny Pacquiao is more than just a fighter. By the time Manny Pacquiao cleared immigration, the incident was already everywhere. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation had spread across Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. The hashtags Jaron Respect All, Jaron Pacquiao, and Justice in 9 Minutes trended worldwide. Millions of people who had never set foot in that airport were now witnesses to the drama. They saw an officer's arrogance. They saw a traveler's dignity. And most importantly, They saw how one man's calmness turned humiliation into justice. News anchors replayed the video on national television. Analysts dissected Manny's words, praising his humility and moral courage. Commentators compared it to his boxing days. In the ring, Manny used his fists. At the airport, he used his voice, and it was just as powerful. But the story didn't end with viral fame. Real consequences followed. The officer who humiliated Manny was officially suspended, his face now infamous across social media. An internal investigation was launched, and other travelers came forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. What had been one man's arrogance was exposed as part of a deeper problem. The immigration department, under immense pressure, announced reforms. Mandatory retraining on ethics and respect would be enforced. Supervisors would monitor officers more closely, and every passenger, regardless of background, was promised fair and professional treatment. For many, Manny's experience became a turning point, a spark for change. Yet, when reporters asked Manny for his reaction, he didn't boast or celebrate. His words were simple. "I didn't stand up for myself. I stood up for everyone who has no voice. Respect should be for all, not just for someone famous." Those words spread even faster than the video itself. They became a quote printed on posters, shared as captions, repeated in classrooms and offices. Meanwhile, the waitress at the airport cafe told reporters, "I've served travelers here for years. People get yelled at all the time by officers. But today I saw hope, because someone finally spoke up." The boy who had recognized Manny earlier posted on social media, "I'll never forget how he stood there so calm, even when insulted. He's not just a champion in the ring, and he's a champion in life." For Manny, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving the officer wrong. It was about teaching a lesson the world desperately needed to hear. That dignity isn't a privilege reserved for the famous or powerful. Dignity is a right. As the story reached international headlines, people around the globe began sharing their own experiences of discrimination and humiliation. The incident became more than just a viral video. It became a movement. And Manny? He went home to his family that night, unchanged by the fame, unshaken by the chaos. Over dinner, he told his children gently, "Always remember, respect is not something you demand. It's something you give, and even to those who don't give it back. But when injustice comes, never stay silent." His children listened wide-eyed, absorbing the lesson that would stay with them for life. The airport confrontation would fade with time, as viral stories often do. But the moral and the message would not. It lived on in every person who watched, every comment that read respect, every traveler who found courage to speak up the next time they faced mistreatment. And that is why this story mattered. Not because a famous man humbled an arrogant officer, but because one act of calm courage reminded the world of a simple truth. No one should be judged by appearance, and everyone deserves respect. If you believe no one should ever be disrespected because of how they look, type respect in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.